Hi, everyone. Hello, my name is Ana Lúcia Araújo. I am professor of history at Harvard University, and this is the Slaveryarchive book club. I am here with my co-host, who is Alex Hill, and we have our co-hosts also who are Jessica Johnson from Johns Hopkins University, and also Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky, but they are not here with us today because they had other commitments and other crises related to the weather. Then today we are receiving here Michael Rothberg, who is a professor of English and Comparative Literature at University of California, Los Angeles, and he is also then the 1939 Society Samuel Goetz Chair in all Holocaust Studies. The book that we are going to discuss today is The Implicated Subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, and this was published by Stanford University Press in 2019. Previous books by Michael Rothberg include then Multidirectional Memory, that you probably know, Remembering the Holocaust in the Age of Decolonization. This is a book that appeared in 2009. Also Traumatic Realism, The Demands of Holocaust Representation from 2000. And also he co-edited with Neil Levy the Holocaust Theoretical Readings in 2003. And he's currently completing another book with Yasemin Yildiz that is titled Inheritance Trouble, Migrant Archives of Holocaust Remembrance, and this will appear with Fordham University Press. And you are going to see that, of course, this book that you are going to discuss today is an interesting one, because not only it's a book about a memory, but also a book that makes connections between the topic of slavery and other atrocities, including the Holocaust. Then by now, I will just let you know that those of you who are on YouTube, you can leave your questions in the chat. Those who are on Zoom, you can, I just ask you to stay mute during the presentation. Michael is going to speak for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then when you want to ask questions at the end of the presentation, you just click on the bottom of the screen on reactions, and you can raise your hand, and you'll be able to ask your questions for those of you who are on Zoom on video. Otherwise, during the presentation, keep your mic mute, and I hope you have a good session. And again, the book is The Implicated Subject, and this is a book that if you didn't read yet, then you know that you can get either at the Stanford University Press website or also on Amazon. Thank you, Michael, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Anna. It's really an honor to be here, a pleasure to be here. And especially because, as you probably know by now, I'm not really a scholar of slavery, but I'm really a scholar of the Holocaust, a literary and cultural studies scholar. Yet I wanted to start, and I'm going to share my screen, by talking a little bit about the fact that though slavery hasn't really been at the center of my work, it's always accompanied my work now for many years, and I think became most explicit in this book, The Implicated Subject. So I thought it might be interesting to just start very briefly to look back a little bit at my two previous books and the way that slavery as a theme, as an issue, started to emerge. And already when I was working on my dissertation, which became my first book called Traumatic Realism, I was starting to think about some of these issues. And for me, a really important moment was the publication of Paul Gilroy's book, The Black Atlantic, and particularly the last chapter of The Black Atlantic, where he brings together the memory of slavery and the memory of Holocaust in what I think was a really important and productive way. And so even though this book, Traumatic Realism, really focuses on the representation of the Holocaust, while at the same time trying to provide a kind of framework that would apply to other traumatic histories as well, I start to make it a little bit more explicit in the conclusion of that book where a kind of comparative project might go. And here I was, it's interesting because in my memory of this book, Gilroy really played a very big role. When I went back to look at it, it's a relatively brief mention, and it's in the context of a discussion of a story by the Jewish American leftist writer Grace Paley, where she brings together memory of the Holocaust, the Israeli occupation, the Haitian refugee crisis of the time, and the AIDS crisis of the time, and kind of puts those different experiences into a non-reductive dialogue, I suppose I would say, an ethical and political dialogue. And so in the conclusion to the book, I do a kind of reading of Paley's story and then make this reference to Gilroy. And it's not the most elegant sentence I think I've ever written, but it was important for me, and it would become more important as my work continued. So I wrote that in working out from the Holocaust in the direction of other histories of oppression, Grace Paley contributes to an ongoing dialogue among diasporic groups and what Paul Gilroy in the Black Atlantic calls other consciousnesses of affliction. And it's that dialogue between different diasporic groups and in particularly different histories of affliction and victimization that really became the center of my second book, Multidirectional Memory. And here, the central question was this one, which I pose on this slide: what happens when memories of different histories confront each other in the public sphere? Does the remembrance of one history erase others from view? When memories of slavery and colonialism bump up against memories of the Holocaust in contemporary multicultural societies, must a competition of victims ensue? And as you can tell there, I think, this was a book I started working on really at the beginning of the 21st century. It was published in 2009, took a while to write. I was responding to and trying to intervene in this discourse about the competition of victims and this notion that that there was something like a competitive memory going on, a competition going on that obeyed the logic of the zero-sum game, right? So, which meant that if you had memory of the Holocaust, you were somehow pushing out memories of slavery or memories of colonialism. That was an argument you saw on one side. On the other side, people who were concerned about the Holocaust were saying, well, if we start to bring in remembrance of slavery or colonialism, other forms of racism, we're going to be somehow relativizing and displacing the Holocaust. And that just seemed to me the wrong way of approaching this question of the dialogue of different memories. And so in the book, I go through a whole series of kind of case studies, many of which have to do with colonialism and decolonization. But slavery also plays a significant role in a couple of places, in particular in a chapter on the novelists Carol Phillips and André Schwartz-Bart, French Jewish writer. And so I just wanted to bring in a couple of quotations from Schwartz-Bart to kind of give a sense of this multi-directional perspective that I was trying to introduce there and that I found in a whole tradition of writers and intellectuals and artists. And so at the end of his 1972 novel, La Mulâtre Solitude, Schwartz-Bart is referring here in this passage to the site of a slave uprising in the Caribbean. And in the context of that evocation of that uprising, at the end of this novel, novel of transatlantic slavery, Schwartz-Bart writes, if the traveler insists, and he's sort of speaking indirectly about himself or about the narrator, it seems here, if the traveler insists, he will be permitted to visit the remains of the old d'Anglemont plantation. If he is in the mood to salute a memory, his imagination will people the environing space, and human figures will rise up around him, just as the phantoms that wander around the humiliated ruins of the Warsaw Ghetto are said to rise up before the eyes of other travelers. So he makes here, I think, a very sympathetic connection, right, between two histories of sort of failed uprisings of slavery and of inmates of the Warsaw Ghetto. And the Warsaw Ghetto plays an important role in the book because of a really amazing short essay by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Negro in the Warsaw Ghetto, which was really kind of the kernel of the project when I began. So this kind of connection across histories, these kind of multi-directional links between slavery here and the Holocaust. And just to show that this was a really important thing, I think also autobiographically for Schwarzbart, around the time that he published the novel, he wrote this sort of moving essay called Pourquoi j'ai écrit la mulâtre solitude, Why I Wrote the Mulâtre Solitude. And he speaks here in his own voice. And he says, certainly this word slavery affected me as a Jewish man, member of a community that had just experienced the price of human life. Schwarzbart was himself a survivor. His family was killed in the Holocaust. And yet, as strange as it might seem to you, the word touched me above all as a Jewish child, as the far-flung descendant of a people born in slavery. And I believe that it is that Jewish child whose fathers were slaves under Pharaoh before becoming so again under Hitler, who was taken by a definitive fraternal love for West Indians. So you see that this solidarity between Black and Jewish histories here passes through the very word slavery as well as the experience of slavery imagined at these different historical moments. Again, in a kind of multi-directional constellation that links the Black Atlantic with, ancient Jewish history as well as more recent Jewish history. And again, this is what I mean by kind of a multi-directional dialogue between different histories and different memories. So that was what I did in multi-directional memory. And as I moved to the implicated subject, I started to take up some other questions. And in particular, I was interested in not only, as I explored for the most part in multi-directional memory, how different histories of victimization come into dialogue with each other, but what happens when we shift subject positions to to perpetrators, to descendants of perpetrators, to bystanders, etc. How do histories start to come into contact there? And this was partly, as I always say in this, and I say briefly in the book, partly an autobiographical project. I was trying to understand my own relationship to those founding American histories, those founding American crimes of slavery and genocide of indigenous people. So it's the place to say that my relationship to the Holocaust and therefore also to slavery is very different from someone like Andrei Schwarzbart, not a survivor of the Holocaust, but rather as a Jewish American whose family emigrated to the United States before the Holocaust even, occupy a very different relationship to those histories. And so I was trying to figure out how to think about, precisely that, what kind of responsibility I bear as a white Jewish American to histories such as slavery and genocide in the Americas. And when I first started to think of this, I didn't really feel I had the vocabulary to talk about these questions in a very precise way as I wanted to. But I actually found inspiration then, as I discuss in the book, in a couple of thinkers who were grappling with the Holocaust, in fact. And one of them was Karl Jaspers, a non-Jewish German philosopher who, right after the Nazi period, wrote this book to try to convince his fellow countrymen of their, I would say, responsibility for the Nazi period and the Holocaust, and against a lot of skepticism, particularly about the Nuremberg trials that were going on at the time, and a kind of refusal of the legitimacy of those trials. And he was trying to convince them, well, actually, there's something important going on here. And Jaspers, in this book, The Question of German Guilt, distinguished between four kinds of what he called guilt. I'm going to shift the terminology in a moment: criminal guilt, political guilt, moral guilt, and metaphysical guilt. Criminal guilt is the guilt of the perpetrator. If you commit a crime, you are criminally guilty. Political guilt, which is the one that interests me most of these categories, is the kind of guilt that you possess by virtue of your membership in a collective, in a political collective. So by virtue of citizenship, right? In other words, you have a certain kind of what he calls political guilt. Metaphysical guilt is a kind of, we're responsible for everything in the world. That doesn't interest me so much, I have to say. Moral guilt, the responsibility we have as individuals for our actions, whatever the legal system in which we're operating, whatever orders we're responding to, that moral guilt remains. And that interests me somewhat. It's especially the political and the moral terrain. I don't, however, think that guilt is the appropriate word once we get beyond criminal guilt, right? Here I want to shift to responsibility. So my book, The Implicated Subject, is really a book about what I call political and historical responsibility. And here I do draw on Arendt, who also also was a friend of Jaspers, a student of his, and then a friend, and in dialogue with him. And a couple of her essays from the 60s, from the post-Eichmann trial period, when she's thinking about some of these same questions in relationship, again, to the Nazi era in particular. So personal responsibility under dictatorship and collective responsibility. So she shifts the terms from guilt to responsibility and starts to think about what it means to bear either personal or collective responsibility under extreme conditions. So this was a good starting point for me, and it led me to my first argument of this book and to the central category of this book. And so I would just want to quickly go over what I think are the three main arguments of the book, three main theses of the book, and then talk quickly about how slavery specifically comes into the book. So my first argument is that we have lacked a vocabulary for talking about indirect forms of responsibility, not direct criminal participation, but the kind of responsibility we bear as members of various sorts of collectives who participate and act indirectly in various forms of violence and injustice. So we must enlarge our understanding of the actors involved in injustices beyond the most often invoked figures of victims, perpetrators, and bystanders. This is vocabulary that especially comes through Holocaust studies. And what I'm offering here is, in particular, I think, a replacement for the notion of the bystander, which for me implies a kind of passivity and disengagement that doesn't capture what I think is so important here about collective responsibility. So in place of the bystander, in a certain sense, I present this notion of the implicated subject, responsible in an indirect way, participating in various injustices. An implicated subject, I emphasize, is a subject position. It's not an identity. In other words, it's multiple. We occupy different positions in relation to different histories. It's not an essentialist identity. It changes historically, situationally, etc. Happy to talk more about that. Like the close but slightly different word complicity, about which there's been a lot of work recently, good work recently, it has the etymological implication of being folded into events and structures. And that's important for me in conceptualizing what it means to be implicated. And finally, I also borrow here from the Italian philosopher Simona Forti in a really great book called New Demons, the notion of the subject as a transmission belt of domination. In other words, the reason I talk specifically about the implicated subject as well as implication is I think that the subject does play a constitutive, as a category, plays a constitutive role in various forms of domination, as again, a kind of transmission belt, even when not a direct perpetrator. So my second argument then is that this notion of implication works on two axes, a diachronic or historical axis and a contemporary or synchronic axis. So I distinguish between, as you see here, diachronic implication and synchronic implication. We're implicated on both axes. Now, in practice, I think that these are often, if not always, intertwined, and sometimes so deeply intertwined, so tangled up that it may not be possible to separate them at all. But I do think analytically, it's worth paying attention to the differences and the way they come together at the same time. And my argument is that implicated subjects play essential roles in producing and reproducing violence and inequality on both of these axes, again, separately and sometimes simultaneously. I've been trying to visualize this a little bit to give people a sense of what I'm talking about with these different forms of implication. And so here are some of the kind of sub-figures of implication that I distinguish between in thinking about this, because it's a sort of implicated subject is a kind of umbrella term that I want to then play out in different contexts. So on this purely synchronic axis, you have something like the enabler, right? The person who enables certain forms of violence to take place by running the trains that are on their way to Auschwitz, for example, right? Without being a perpetrator in a case like that. On the other end, in a purely diachronic sense, I've been searching for a good word for this, and for the moment I've settled on successor, trying to be somewhat neutral here, the person who comes after a crime. So here I'm thinking that the classic example is something like the second, third, fourth generation German after the Holocaust, right? What kind of relationship do they have to the events of the Holocaust? They bear a kind of moral responsibility by virtue of being German, by virtue of belonging to a particular national collective. And so that I call successor. And then in between, because they they can work on both axes, and sometimes, again, maybe inseparably, are beneficiaries, again, a category about which there's been some very good work recently, and then what I call perpetuators, right? Beneficiaries, I think you can be a beneficiary both of synchronic relations, right? Say global capitalism, global inequities, sweatshop labor happening far away. We're not perpetrators of sweatshop labor, but we benefit from it. Beneficiary also has a strong diachronic dimension, right? We benefit from the dispossessions that happened in previous generations, say from slavery as white Americans, for example. We're beneficiaries of that historical moment. Perpetuator works in different contexts. I use it especially in the book to think about long distance nationalism. And here my interest is in the role that diasporic Jews, like American Jews, for example, play in perpetuating the Israeli occupation of Palestine. To give one example, right? Again, we're not perpetrators of that occupation, and yet in various ways, both ideological and material, we're often helping to perpetuate it. So I'll keep moving because I don't want to speak for too long. Third and last important thesis I want to introduce is that many people find themselves complexly implicated, right? With lines of connection, direct or indirect, to both histories of victimization and perpetration. Again, because these are subject positions and the social field is complicated, we often find ourselves complexly situated, right, with relations to both the position of the perpetrator and the position of the victim. And so I've tried to visualize this a little bit too. And I think this happens in a couple of different ways. I think on the one hand, you can have sort of post-memories of victimization that then link you to either current or historical injustices. So in other words, you might be the descendant of Holocaust. I'll give some examples in just a second. You could be the descendant of Holocaust survivors. You find yourself in a situation like Israel or the contemporary United States, where you are now implicated in other injustices that are happening in the present. Or you can potentially actually be yourself a victim who then finds themselves in a new situation, again, implicated in injustices that are either taking place in the contemporary moment or that you have kind of migrated into, that took place historically. And I've tried to come up with a few examples, and these are really, coming from my own particular concerns. I think one could expand this in a lot of different directions. So for example, again, thinking about my own position as an American Jew in relationship to slavery, as a Jew, you have a memory of various forms of oppression, of anti-Semitism, potentially of the Holocaust, of pogroms in Eastern Europe, like the ones my family fled, in the early part of the 20th century. So you have a post-memory of suffering, a post-memory of victimization, but you enter into a situation in which there were other diachronic injustices that you now find yourself responsible for. I think that, I was doing a panel recently that had something to do with Japanese Canadians who were interned and dispossessed like Japanese Americans were during the Second World War. And yet, so this is my top left-hand corner, racialized immigrants in Canada. And yet the land that they were dispossessed of had itself been taken away from Indigenous people of that region as well, on the west coast of Canada as well. So they were both victimized very clearly, and at the same time implicated subjects, implicated in an ongoing settler colonial project. And you can kind of play this out for all the different combinations, but I don't want to take up too much time, so I will keep going. There are two chapters in the book in which slavery comes in specifically. In a smaller way, in this chapter on the South African Jewish artist William Kentridge, which for me is really precisely an exploration of complex implication, right? What does it mean to be Jewish, to have, again, a memory of persecution from the Nazis, from local anti-Semitism in South Africa, and yet at the same time, as a white person in transitional apartheid and then transitional South Africa, be implicated in the apartheid racial regime and a beneficiary of that regime. And I think that's what Kentridge is exploring in so much of his work. And here you have an image of kind of the implicated white bystander, right, watching as the masses parade by in a political demonstration. It's that kind of, on the one hand, disconnection from what's happening, but also clear implication in what's happening that I think Kentridge shows so well. And he does it through these two alter ego figures, Soho Eckstein, who's the guy in the pinstripe suit, and Felix Teitelbaum, who's always naked, who's seen here, who's a kind of artist figure. And they're both figures of Kentridge and opportunities for him to work out, again, I think, his implication in apartheid and post-apartheid histories. And slavery comes in particular in this film Mine, which is about Soho, who is a mine owner. And in this film, I don't really have time to talk about the technique. These are hand-drawn animated films that use a lot of kind of palimpsestic layering of images. So Soho is lying in bed, he kind of rings a bell and his coffee magically appears through some invisible servant. He plunges the plunger on his French press coffee and the plunger keeps going down. It goes through the little tray on his bed, it goes through the bed, it goes down into the mine shafts, which are depicted as right below his bedroom. It goes through the head of a miner. As you can see in this image here, it starts to carve it goes down into the rock of the walls of the mine and starts to carve out a kind of a shape in the rock, which turns out to be this shape, which I think everybody involved in this session today will immediately recognize, but comes as kind of a shock when you're watching the film unfold. It's sort of unexpected. And once you see that historical resonance, which of course refers to this, you start to notice other historical resonances, like the fact that this image here of the miner's compound seems so closely modeled on this image from the liberation of Buchenwald, right? Very similar kind of image. There's a young Elie Wiesel in there somewhere. And then you start to think about the showers that you also see of the miners in the showers. And so there's a very strong resonance of the Holocaust at the same time that you have a very direct invocation of slavery. So it's multi-directional for sure. And that's one of the points I make, but it's also an exploration of perpetration and implication, right? So Soho is clearly a perpetrator of these inhuman mining conditions, but what's his relationship to slavery, right? There it's more a relationship of what I would call implication. And maybe more interesting, why does Kentridge himself stage his own alter ego in this kind of scenario, right? What I think there, from the perspective of the artist, it's an exploration of his implication in these historical relations of enslavement, of a sort of modern slavery of the mines, and then also this kind of complicated, complex implication in the Holocaust, a sort of post-memory of the Holocaust that exists there at the same time. But slavery comes up, especially, of course, if you've had a chance to look at the book, you'll know, in chapter 2, which is called On Not Being a Descendant, Implicated Subjects and the Legacies of Slavery. And what I do in this chapter is to juxtapose Jamaica Kincaid's well-known text, A Small Place, with the Catherine Hall and Nicholas Draper project, Legacies of British Slave Ownership, as a way of thinking about the question of how we can think about redress beyond the victim-perpetrator binary, right? Redress from the perspective of implicated subjects. What do implicated subjects owe in terms of restitution, in terms of reparation? And I mentioned Elazar Barkan's important book, The Guilt of Nations, a sort of survey of restitution discourses, where he writes, the novelty of the discourse of restitution is that it is a discussion between the perpetrators and their victims. Okay, I think that's an important point and obviously true for many situations, say post-Holocaust Germany and the whole question of reparations there. But there are a couple of problems that complicate that. One is that most post-conflict or post-violence societies are heterogeneous in ways that make it hard to limit the relevant players, right, to perpetrators and their victims, right? So there's a kind of social heterogeneity one has to take into account. And then as we think about what happens over the course of generations when an injustice is left to fester, to haunt us, right? Those transgenerational legacies don't play out between perpetrators and victims. They play out between the descendants or even others who migrate into these situations, right? So the complexity is greater, I think, than Barkan acknowledges, at least in that one place. So my question is, what does it mean to be implicated in slavery when you are not a descendant of those who were enslaved, and maybe not a descendant of those who did the enslaving, right? What does historical responsibility look like for implicated subjects? And here I make in the chapter a distinction. I'll come back to this again in a moment. I sort of try to break down the category of the beneficiary into what I call genealogical implication and structural implication. Genealogical implication refers to those who have a direct familial connection back to the crime that's at stake, in this case, slavery. Structural implication is those who benefit from that crime without actually having that kind of direct genealogical link. And I explore this toward the end of the chapter through the one place where I kind of found Kincaid's text and the Legacies project intersecting, and that was around the Codrington family, a major slave-owning family in Antigua and Barbuda. And there is one Christopher Bethel Codrington who shows up in the archive here. And also the family is mentioned, as you'll see, or as you already know, in Kincaid's text. And so what I'm trying to distinguish here is both sort of methodologically, what can a kind of historical approach like that of the archive offer, and what can a literary text offer, and how can we bring those together? That's one thing. And then also, again, the genealogical connections that are found versus these more structural ones. So it's easy enough to trace, just a quick search online, I was able to find the Codrington family tree, and you can come right down to the present and see who are the descendants of these slave owners. And I'm sure a lot of you who do this kind of research also know. And this reminds me of the chapter on collective memory in Anna's book, which I'll also give a pitch for here, where she talks about the Thomas Jefferson and his family and the DeWolf family in Rhode Island. And so you can trace genealogical links back to slave owners, of course, but that's actually not what Kincaid is interested in a small place. She's interested in the way others start to intervene in this history and to benefit from it. So she gives this interesting example of what happened in Antigua, where the papers of the slave trading family from Barbuda, she always calls them the Codringtons for some reason, the records of their traffic in human lives were being auctioned. The government of Antigua made a bid for them. Someone else made a larger bid. He was the foreigner. This is a sort of like neo-colonial figure who she refers to a few times during the course of the text. His bid was the successful bid. He then made a gift of these papers to the people of Antigua. And what does it mean? The records of one set of enemies bought by another enemy, given to the people who have been their victims as a gift. And gift here with that, I think, resonance that you see, especially in German, of poison as well, right? A poisonous gift in a sense. So on the one hand, you have the Codrington family tree, which is an example of genealogical implication. On the other hand, you have this figure of the foreigner, as Kincaid calls him, who is structurally implicated, or stands in here, I think, for those who are structurally implicated. And I draw on some terminology that Nicholas Draper uses in his book about things being intimate and diffuse. And I argue that genealogical implication, the Codrington family, right, is intimate. In other words, it's familial, it's right within the family, as it were, but it's diffuse, right? By the time you go over the course of several generations, whatever the direct material benefit from slavery that existed has been kind of dispersed and diffused to a certain extent over the course of the generations, right? Family trees are ultimately pretty complicated things. For those of us, I include myself, who are structurally implicated, right? We don't have an intimate relation to the past like the family would. Our implication in that sense is diffuse, and yet it's intimate in that our very subjectivity, I would argue, is produced by, constructed by these structural relations of race and class, as well as gender, et cetera, nation, that we find ourselves in, right? So our very intimate subjectivity is at the center of these diffuse structural determinations, right? So I make this kind of distinction. Now, of course, most of those who are genealogically implicated will also be structurally implicated, right? If you're the white descendant of slave owners, at least, right? You are not only genealogically implicated, you're also going to be structurally implicated. But the vice versa is not true, right? You can be structurally implicated without having any kind of genealogical implication in the events at stake at all. Again, immigrant families who come after slavery would be, white immigrant families in particular would be the example. So just to conclude, and with the way I conclude the chapter, I wouldn't say I solved the problem of reparations precisely at all, but just trying to think through how implication can help us to think about the question of reparations and redress and restitution in a broad sense. And I think that they're both, obviously on both the side of genealogical and structurally implicated people, need for both material kinds of redress as well as some various symbolic ones. And here's what I write, and I'll just finish there. Approaching reparations from the side of implication involves explaining how white subjects in former slaveholding and slave trading societies are collectively responsible for the legacies of the past without being criminally guilty. So you hear the echo of Arendt and Jaspers there, I hope. It involves mobilizing both the historical lessons that a project such as Legacies of British Slave Ownership can make available about the centrality of slave capital to capitalist society, and the rhetorical power that Kincaid's A Small Place uses to produce feelings of discomfort. An approach based on implication suggests the need for work both in the realm of recognition, the deconstruction of a white identity founded on denial of implication and historical injustice, and in the realm of material well-being, where some form of redistribution in the direction of equality would offset the persistence of ongoing inequities. So I'll just leave it there. Hope I haven't taxed your patience too much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you. And what I do now is just to start asking you if you have questions, that you raise your hands. Of course, some of us, you have several questions, then you don't need to ask all of them together if you have more than one. Then who are the first candidates? They are shy, but they'll come.
Yeah.
Okay. Then in this case, I will. Okay, let me just see. I have a number of questions, but then I will just. Okay, I have someone here. Let's see. We have a question in the chat, and Devin, do you want to perhaps ask your question on video, or you want to have this on? Okay, you are there.
Yeah, no, I totally can.
Wonderful. Then let me just add you here. Okay.
Perfect. Yeah, so we actually read in one of the classes that I'm in at Brigham Young University the implicated subject, and I found it fascinating, and it really resounded with me. I'm studying humanities, especially in the Middle East and in the East Asia as well. And so just kind of looking at the events that are going on today and the way that we have more access than ever before to these atrocities that are going on. I just wanted to get your thoughts on if you feel like the advent of social media and mass media at large has made us all implicated subjects even more actively and obviously than before, and more obvious than before, in international atrocities, such as the Uyghur camps in Xinjiang and other atrocities as well.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And I think it's a really important one. Not an easy one exactly, I think, but definitely something to think about and to discuss. I mean, I think that, one of the things that your reference to the media brings to mind is that certainly, I think that implication does, again, it changes historically, as I tried to indicate, and that the question of the media, of technology, is one of the ways that I suppose implication is always transforming itself, and in some sense it seems growing, I suppose, as through the forces of globalization, and not just media or social media, but more broadly the forces of globalization bring the world more and more into contact. That creates, I think, necessarily more forms of implication. I think that what I would try to probably make some distinctions, though, and say that I'm not sure that in my terms, everything that we are aware of or that we can view through our devices necessarily produces what I would want to call implication, right? And so I think that there has to be some sort of ultimately a causal link, I suppose, that connects us. And it's not a direct causal link I'm looking for here. And I think that's important, and that gets very complicated to conceptualize, right? But I think there has to be some way in which we bear a kind of indirect responsibility, not simply as human beings, right, but as participants in structures such as right, capitalist globalization, or by virtue of our position as tax-paying citizens of the United States, right, which certainly implicates us in a lot of things all over the world. And so I think, you know, without sort of talking about a particular example, I think I would say that yes, that we are put into contact with much more, that our responsibility grows because of the kinds of technological advances that are associated with the spread of and development of media. But I don't think that all of those links and every form of our awareness necessarily, again, makes us implicated immediately. And here, you know, I would go back maybe to Jaspers's categories, you know, in a certain sense, right, in that notion of metaphysical guilt that he mentions, we are, in his model, we are all metaphysically guilty, or, you know, if you wanted to translate it into my terms, metaphysically responsible for anything that happens essentially anywhere on the globe. And I guess I'm looking for a slightly more material connection between these different locations in order to explain how implication is different from a kind of metaphysical, human, universal responsibility. I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer. Maybe we can keep talking about it, but that's sort of my initial attempt to respond there. So in other words, you know, if we are responsible for what's going on in China, and I'm certainly not saying that we're not, and that we're not implicated in it, for example, I guess I want to establish, like, on what grounds, from what position are we implicated, right? Is it as, again, Americans? Is it as beneficiaries of a global capitalist system, right? What is it? So I think that it's easy to move into a kind of metaphysical frame of we are all implicated and we're all implicated in everything. But I think that's less useful than if we can actually trace lines of connection, however indirect they might be. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you, Michael. I see we have another question from Amy Chin. I don't know, Amy, if you want to put yourself on video or if you just want to go orally.
Yeah, I can just ask a question. Thank you so much for this presentation. It was great. I really enjoyed the book, and it's so generative for me as I'm writing the dissertation right now. My question is a little bit more focused on your first chapter on reading the Combahee River Collective, actually. And I'd love for you to talk more about the difference, or if there is a difference, between personal responsibility or ordinary responsibility we have to each other by virtue of being being connected to one another, right, as humans.
Right.
And then how that's different in terms of political responsibility with a capital P.
Right.
Because it makes me think about the core of the statement, right, is that we're all connected and we're trying to resist these hierarchies of oppression, right, by virtue of being all connected. So we need each other on deck, right, in order to make lives more livable. And so I'm wondering how you're trying to square that away with suggesting that particular violences, right, create certain maybe ruptures to these relationships, and then that political responsibility taking on like a different form. So I guess the difference between this like human rights kind of oriented responsibility to fellow humans and responsibility in the political sphere.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. Yeah, and I'd love to hear sometime about what your project is that you're working on. So feel free to contact me about that if you'd like. Yeah, I think that question is certainly related to Devin's question as well. what you're talking about, the sort of the human rights, a sort of moral, you almost called it ordinary responsibility there, I think is close to what I was talking about there as this kind of, almost the metaphysical version. I mean, I do think that in some ways, at least certain versions of human rights and a kind of liberal human rights model in which we're not implicated, but kind of distant observers of suffering of people far away, is close to this Jaspers category of metaphysical guilt, which I'm trying to move away from, right, in place of a kind of more political notion of responsibility. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, and the Combahee River Collective, as you know from reading it, and if you haven't read it, then I can say a little bit about it. I almost had is important to me in thinking about implication, and particularly in thinking about complex implication. And I had a slide about that actually, and then took it out at the last minute, which is probably just as well, because I think I talked too much, but I can try to say something about it here. I mean, for me, the core of the Combahee River Collective statement is this notion of interlocking oppressions, right? Which then is the kind of forerunner of the notion of intersectionality as it will be developed later. And what fascinated me about that, among other things, I think it's just a great statement in so many ways, but what I found really interesting when I started to think about it in relation to the project I was working on, this project on implication, was that the very notion of intersectionality and of interlocking oppressions necessarily produces the figure of the implicated subject. And the quotation that I used to illustrate that from the CRC statement is the one where they make a kind of distinction between their position as Black women and that of Black men and white women, right? And they say that, of course, we share an experience of racism with Black men, and yet at the same time, they're implicated. They don't use the terms, but it's almost there, right? They're implicated in certain patriarchal sexist structures. White women, we share an experience of gender oppression, except that they're also implicated in white supremacy at the same time. And so that the figures in the text of the Black man on the one hand, and I emphasize these are figures, I'm not talking about actual people here, of the Black man, of the white woman, are these figures of a kind of complex implication, right? Of people who are complexly situated in the social and have lines of connection, both to systems of domination and to experiences of being dominated on one axis or other. And obviously they're trying to think of the simultaneity of that, but my point is that thinking of the very simultaneity of interlocking oppressions necessarily leads us to having to posit the existence of people who are also implicated subjects. And I guess for me, it's that location within specific systems of interlocking oppression that makes the difference, and it's the essential difference between a political notion of responsibility and a kind of generically human sense of moral or ethical responsibility, which I'm not against, right? Which I don't think is a bad thing. It's not that that's unimportant, but I think following what you were saying, I think that's a different order of responsibility than what I'm trying to get at with my notion of implication, right? Because implication follows from particular histories and particular structures. And I do think that's what the CRC is getting at in their statement. It's not just about, we all need to get together, but it's, yeah, we all need to get together, but we're all also very differently situated in these histories and in these structures. And we have to account for those differences at the same time that we need to think about ways of creating alliances, right? So it's interesting. I did also find it interesting that though this is kind of the origins of identity politics in the sense that they talk specifically about identity politics for the first time, the members of the collective are also very clear and have always been very clear about the need for coalition and alliance, right? And so, and for me, that also leads to this notion that of the implicated subject as a possible ally in coalitional politics, right? In different kinds of alliances. Not that they would lead those alliances or coalitions, it seems, but they would participate in them, and that they would necessarily participate in them, and that the CRC recognizes the necessity of those kinds of coalitions, not only across identity lines, but across these positions of victim implicated subject, et cetera, et cetera. So I think it's, again, for me, the difference there, just to restate, is that implication arises from material histories and structural relations, and not simply from the fact of our being human, right? It's not, I think, for me at least, again, a kind of metaphysical term, but a sort of a social and historical one. I hope that gets at it, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. And now we have Laura, who has her hand raised. Laura, do you want to come on video? Yes, you want.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, my hand was raised. Yes. Thank you, Michael. I have this book. I haven't, I have looked through it, but I have not read it yet. But it appears to me to sort of begin with Jaspers and Arendt and questions of the law, actually guilt and the law. And these are people who have in front of them an urgent question in the synchronic time of cases before the judge. But then what you do, and I think it's adumbrated by the idea of intimacy, both and this diffuse but intimate is very fascinating to me. There's a close genealogical relation, but there's also this other kind of diffuse relation, but it's intimate, felt on the inside.
Yeah.
So it looks to me like the book then moves to Kentridge, to other artists who give us the intimate that's missing from the law. And it makes me think about the critical legal theory and critical race theory and feminist race legal critical race of the not really the 80s and 90s, when people were feeling that the law was not sufficient, not because the law didn't have categories and things, but because it didn't have an inside, and it had there was no intimate center, that it was missing. If for certain kinds of subjects, particularly African American, it was missing the inside of the of what the law is the outside of. And so people had to start telling stories. So think about Patricia Williams, or think about Derek Bell, telling stories that you needed to get to fiction in order to get back to the law. And that is an interesting move. But as I page through your book, you move from the law to the stories, but I'm wondering if you get back to the law in a kind of analogy to the interventions that critical legal theory and critical race theory at this earlier kind of interstitial time between the immediate post-Holocaust legal trials and us now. The critical legal storytelling is in the middle. And I'm wondering what you think. I mean, and I'll tell you what made me think about this directly was you're saying that the engineer of the train to Auschwitz is not implicated, but not
is implicated.
Is not guilty, but he's implicated. Yeah. But as far as I know, and I'm thinking about certain spectacular cases where the driver of the getaway car is in jail. I mean, or the guy who helped somebody else get a gun is guilty in the law. And so what I'm wondering is how you get back to the law, or if you want to get back to the law, or is it important to get back to the law, or do we need to have to go somewhere else? And thank you. I'll mute myself.
Thank you, Laura. That's a really, really fascinating question and gets at some really important questions, I think. I mean, I think the truth of the matter, just to answer it in the simplest terms, no, I don't think I get back to the law. And in some ways I'm arguing, and again, I had a slide here, but not one I use today. I'm arguing that we need to look beyond the law to solve some of these kinds of problems. And I appreciate, it was nice to be reminded of Patricia Williams and some of that kind of work, because I haven't thought about it in a while, I have to admit. but it was, certainly important to me at a certain moment, but I didn't have that so much in mind. So I guess my thinking about the limits of the law had less to do with this lack of an insight, as you put it, than the lack of its purchase on certain kinds of structural questions and also certain kinds of historical questions. So it's not, I think it's sometimes taken this way, and maybe I phrase it this way at times. I don't think it's meant ultimately as an anti-legal argument, though maybe it does have that in it. And I guess I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not really an expert in those realms. I've often wondered about, a kind of abolitionist response to the notion of criminal guilt and how we would want, where we would want to go with that. But I haven't really thought that through all the way either. Let me come back to what I meant about the structural versus the inside, though I agree with you that this notion of the intimate is important, and that certainly when I'm looking at figures like Kentridge or later Hito Steyrl, the German artist, certainly part of what I'm interested in is the way they're exploring these very intimate, diffuse yet intimate, and sometimes just intimate and intimate relations of implication. So that's absolutely important to me. But I guess, again, I'm not trying to approach it through the law. I mean, that's absolutely true. The example I gave of the trains to Auschwitz, I was thinking less of the driver, though again, I think it probably would hold for the driver, than even like the office worker working on the schedules and this sort of thing, right? So the bureaucrat, this kind of bureaucratic involvement. And I guess, again, it's just meant as an example of the fact that there are always, especially in large scale political violence, many, many, many more people involved participating than you could ever bring before a court. Not just for the practical reasons of there are hundreds of thousands of perpetrators and how are we going to try them all? Problems like you had in Rwanda, for example, but rather that, there are some people who simply have not committed a crime, right? Even, that there's no legal system that would bring some of these participants to court to put on trial. And that this probably wouldn't be what we'd want to do anyway if we could. That's the second, and sort of pushing more toward the abolitionist perspective, I suppose, too. Is the criminal justice system the place you want to play out and address some of these issues? But for me, and the example I give, I think, in the introduction, is the example of the Trayvon Martin case. And I was particularly interested in this one sort of response that emerged, social media response, to go back to the social media question, response that emerged after the acquittal of George Zimmerman. And it was this project, and it was a moment when you'll remember there was, for understandable reasons, a lot of people pronouncing identification with Trayvon Martin. I am Trayvon Martin, we are all Trayvon Martin. And then I think there started to be unease with that. What are white people doing saying, I am Trayvon Martin? White people are not Trayvon Martin, right? We should be careful about that kind of identification. We can think of other examples of that as well, where identification sounds good until you start to interrogate the logic of it. We're all immigrants, right? If you remember during the Muslim ban protests, and then indigenous activists saying, but wait a minute, we're not all immigrants, in fact, right? We have to have a more complicated analysis. Anyway, I was intrigued by this response on social media, website, We Are Not Trayvon Martin, right? Which was this opportunity for people to talk about, in my terms, their implication, right? In other words, we cannot identify with Trayvon Martin because we are in fact implicated in the system of white supremacy that led to his murder. So in the context of that, I say that, of course, I think, again, the abolitionist question comes up, but of course, we think George Zimmerman should have been acquitted. In any case, he certainly should have been held responsible for his criminal guilt, right? He's clearly criminally guilty in those terms of Jaspers. But even if he had been convicted, would that solve the problem? No, because the problem is structural, right? It has to do with white supremacy. It has to do with racist structures that are so deeply and embedded in and widely spread throughout our society that the individualistic nature of legal justice cannot resolve them, right? Cannot address those deeper problems. And that's something that, Arendt also thought about in relationship to the Holocaust, and she changed her mind about that at a certain point. At a certain moment, she said, these crimes are so monstrous that criminal guilt is impossible to think about, right after the war in response to Jaspers. Later, she changed her mind and said, no, actually, perpetrators like Eichmann need to be held responsible. But at the same time, that's insufficient, right? So it's both necessary. So I guess my position, to kind of come to a conclusion here, would be that the law is necessary but insufficient, and that probably we also want to be rethinking criminal guilt itself, or at least punishment, right, I suppose. But that ultimately the kinds of problems that I'm interested in relationship to implication are ones that exceed the model of individual responsibility, which is built into the legal system as I understand it. And certainly as Jaspers is talking about it in terms of criminal guilt, and as Arendt will then also affirm, right? You can only be guilty of what you've actually done directly. And what I'm interested in is how we're responsible for things that we didn't do directly, and yet that we still contributed to, and that we still participated in indirect ways.
Thank you, Michael. And we have two other questions, one by Kofo Adeleke, another one, Bianca Primo also has her hand raised. Then we are going to start with Kofo. If you want to, do you want to turn on your video, Kofo?
I'm not going to turn on my video because I'm in a country where the internet is not very good. So please bear with me. But
okay, go ahead.
I just want to thank you for this book. It has come at a very important time. The Black Lives Matter movement has put African history, slave trade history into much, much greater focus now. And so there's a demand for this type of information. Now, I want to specifically talk about the situation in the UK now, in the United Kingdom. Many heritage institutions in the United Kingdom are opening up their archives that were never opened up before, and they are providing direct access to material about how families and institutions benefited from the slave trade. And this is creating a huge backlash. There are accusations that this is destroying British culture. Why is all this being dredged up? Are they trying to force white people to feel guilty? And, your book, I think, illuminates some of these complexities and could really provide a greater understanding. But the problem is your book is sort of academic, and we need to distill this information so that, people, ordinary people who are having these conversations can have a response, a response. And, because on both sides, there's trauma, there's guilt. And some of us are not really able to articulate it as well as we can. So one of the, for example, a lot of people are saying that, transatlantic slave trade, that's ancient history. They want to put it in the ancient history thing. They're equating it with Roman slaves. I say, my ancestors were slaves in Roman times, blah, 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 And if you try to compare it with the Jewish Holocaust, they will not accept that at all. That's totally unacceptable. And, it's really a huge problem. And so one of the things I would just like to ask you, is it possible for you to distill some of the information in your book and write some essays in newspaper magazines so that it could actually, what you're saying, get to a much wider audience? Because, a lot of books that are written, with, universities, they just don't really get out there. So I just don't know what you could do to actually, explain more to a wider range of people who would not necessarily buy your book. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, just thank you. That's a really kind comment and very, very flattering. And it makes me very happy to know that you find it potentially useful. And so I really appreciate that. And that means a lot to me, because I feel, I write in a pretty scholarly and academic mode for the most part. I understand that, but what I'm writing about, I think these are issues that I think we all agree are really important ones and are really crucial ones and are really very present in our society. So I, of course, want to help contribute to those kinds of discussions, certainly not alone, but with other people who are doing similar kinds of work and with activists who are doing similar kinds of work. You know, I do feel like at some level, some of the basic ideas here are not that complicated, you know, and so it should be possible to distill them. And I will definitely take that to heart and think about how to do that. You know, I was invited because of this book to take part in a discussion now, gosh, this last year, right, of course, has been a decade long. So who can remember exactly when it was? I think it was probably in June or July, organized by someone from the Armenian community in New Jersey who wanted to have a discussion about responsibility, precisely among people in a community of people who feel themselves, rightly so, right, to be either direct victims or at this point really descendants of victims, right, descendants of victims of a genocide. And yet in the United States, this organizer, you know, felt strongly are also implicated in, you know, in various kinds of racial violence and racial politics as people who are basically white, you know, find themselves to be. And so he was trying to create an event, which we had, and I think was pretty successful. There were hundreds of people who attended to try to, in the context of the, you know, reemergent Black Lives Movement after the George Floyd murder, to try to talk about some of these issues and try to kind of break it down for people who I think, and I felt very sympathetic to this because as a Jewish American, I think there's some similar dynamics, right? Because of the Holocaust that you just alluded to, people often resist being named as implicated, right? Especially if they have a history of victimization, which is very real and is not that far in the past, as Jews do, as Armenians do. And so for me, yeah, I think that the key categories here are this notion of complex implication. And again, this is not the language you'd want to use for maybe a non-academic audience, but to try to convey this complexity, right? That you can be two things at once, right? That you can be the descendant of victims and yet at the same time be implicated in things that are happening now. That on the one hand, and then I think the other thing that is easier to explain and maybe in some ways is really crucial is this distinction between guilt and responsibility. And here's again where I think the Jaspers is really useful, though again, I do find it important to change the terminology slightly, to say to people, look, nobody's saying you are guilty of the slave trade, right? That's physically impossible. We're talking about a historical era that none of us lived through directly. And yet, despite not being guilty, criminally guilty, individual perpetrators, we still are, by virtue of our identities, we are collectively responsible. And I think that shift from guilt to responsibility is an important one, both because I think it's more precise and accurate to describe the relationship that those of us have in the present to things that happened earlier or maybe that are happening far away, but also because I think there's an ambiguity to the word guilt, which is for me part of the problem with it, which is that it on the one hand describes, to go back to Laura's question, a legal relationship, right? You're guilty if you've committed a crime, but it's also a feeling, right? We feel guilty. And I think there's a confusion that takes place there. People say, I don't want to feel guilty because I am not criminally guilty, in a sense. And to me, the response then is to say, that's right. You're not criminally guilty. And in fact, I don't want you to feel guilty. I want you to feel responsible, right? I want you to understand your position in society and everything that entails. And not in order to put you on trial, but nevertheless to provoke some sort of response, right? To provoke some sort of feelings of solidarity for those who are still suffering from either injustices that happened in the past whose effects continue into the present, or new ones that are building on that history. So, I mean, this is not a direct answer to how do I put this in, can I put this in terms for a broader public, but I'll take that to heart and think about it. And I appreciate that you think that would be an important thing, and that means a lot to me. And I feel a responsibility then also to try to do that. And I guess I do feel like it's possible, because I think at the core, what's at issue here is so widespread, is so omnipresent in different contexts, that it's something that people can understand and can be made to understand. So thanks very much for that comment.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I think we're going to take a question from Bianca Premo now. Bianca?
Hi, thank you very much, Michael. I enjoyed, if you don't mind me using your first name, I'm Bianca. I enjoyed reading some of the book. I haven't finished it. So I have two questions, but I'll just ask one since Ana Lucia said that we were only allowed one at a time. And it's just an invitation
You
for
can ask more.
Okay. I wanted to invite you to talk a little bit about how you're theorizing history. It's actually, you write at several junctures about the entanglement of history with contemporary structure. And in some places, it seems to me that history is impinging. You have even the word incessantly in there, that it impinges and it doesn't allow implicated subjects to rest in their unconsciousness or in their lack of association with the structures that they participate in. And so it occurs to me that maybe there's more that you might want to say about how you see history functioning and how it functions together with structure, whether it's the kind of thing that can act to bring implication to a subject's consciousness and therefore transform it into action, or whether it is actually the thing that action and agency is acting upon. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, interesting, real interesting. And I think there's a lot to, I agree that there's a lot more to be said about these categories and a lot more kind of theorization. In a way, this goes in the exact opposite direction of the previous question, which is sort of asking to sort of break it down, and you're asking for more complication, which I think is both are totally legitimate. In fact, I'm interested in both, right? Being able to communicate this in very straightforward ways, but also to delve more deeply into it. In terms of how I'm thinking about history and structure and what kind of allows or forces at times subjects to recognize their implication, let me back up for a moment. I think generally when I'm talking about history and structure, what I'm trying to get at are, again, diachronic relations and synchronic relations. I guess I do find that language useful, coming out of structuralism. Even if it's problematic in some ways, needs to be complicated in some ways. It does seem to me that there's a difference between how we are positioned in relationship, let's stick with our prime example today, transatlantic slavery, and how we are positioned in relationship to structures of white supremacy today. So I think that in a first moment, I try to make that analytical distinction and say, well, there are, histories that are over in some sense, and then there are structures and unfolding events that continue in the present, right? So the Holocaust is over, and yet it's a diachronic, right? It's something we are related to diachronically, and yet if you're Jewish, especially if you're Jewish and have a family genealogical connection, like Mariana Hirsch would call post-memory, the afterlives of the Holocaust are very real. The transmission of the Holocaust over generations is very real. And so impinges on the present and shapes the present. But it does it because, but it's still, at the same time, it still remains, I think, an event that is somehow in the past. So I guess, the first way I understand myself as using history and structure is precisely to make that kind of distinction between events that we can locate somewhere as completed and yet still impacting us through their legacies, through their afterlives, through their haunting, through injustices that remain to be addressed, all of those sorts of things. That's what I mean, that's what I mean by history. And structure, I mean, the unfolding world system of capitalism, the contemporary structures of white supremacy in which we find ourselves, the structures of patriarchy in which we find ourselves. Now, where I think it gets really complicated is then the second step is to say, but okay, if there are legacies, if there are afterlives, if there are hauntings, are these things not also present, right, in some sense? And of course they are, and that's really the whole point, I suppose. And so when I showed that slide of where I was trying to map out synchronic and diachronic Implication, and you remember in the middle of it, I had the categories of the beneficiaries and the perpetuators. These are places, again, where I think history and structure really become entangled. It does seem to me, maybe in the concept of the beneficiary, you can still distinguish and say, well, okay, I am benefiting from X that happened in the past. Here I am benefiting from Y that's happening in the present. Though again, the Y that's happening in the present is built on that past. And so again, can we actually separate these at the end of the day? In terms of this question of perpetuation, I find it at the moment, at least, even harder to separate these two axes of the diachronic and the synchronic, because what does it mean to perpetuate? It means precisely to reproduce, to give continued life to something that happened in the past, or that allegedly happened in the past. And here then I think about something like settler colonialism. And so when we, again, as non-Indigenous people in the United States, occupy this land, unceded territory, as I am right now in Los Angeles, of the Tongva and Gabrielino people, and as probably a lot of people here are in their own spaces, in their own territories, I am perpetuating both the histories and the structures of settler colonialism, the initial invasion, and then this structural fact of settler colonialism, like Patrick Wolf might talk about it. So we're in a region where it becomes really difficult to even distinguish between those two categories. So someone like Wolf, I think, is useful for thinking about some of that. The other person who I find very valuable is this theorist of history named Berber Bevernage, who I refer to at a couple of points in the book. And he uses this idea of a politics of time. It's not his own coining, but he kind of plays it out. The politics of time, the very way that we construct a difference between past and present, right, already has a kind of politics embedded in it, right? So if we consider, the colonization of America, something that happened simply in the past, right? There's already a politics that emerges in that separation of the now and the then. And I guess I'm trying to work in two different directions, both to say, we can't really untangle those things. They really are in the very present moment when there are injustices that remain to be addressed. We can't really make a simple distinction between now and then, because the then is still with us in the present. And yet at the same time, I'm also arguing, and I guess I still hold to it, that it's an analytically useful distinction to be able to differentiate between injustices that arise from the past and those that unfold in the present. And again, I think just to think of the Kentridge that I talked about earlier, you see that in the Mine film. I wish I'd been able to show the clip, but again, I didn't want to take up too much time, where he's talking about, relations, capital labor relations in the present, and yet he's setting them in this kind of echo chamber where, the slave ship is still very present, and where the Holocaust is also very present. And there was a lot of discussion in the, 70s, 80s in South Africa of the mines as a kind of version of a totalitarian camp, right? So that's one echo. That's one reason I think that the Holocaust echoes there, is that the very relations of kind of enslavement and of hyper-exploitation in the mines were themselves echoes of kind of a totalitarian camp system. So again, those relations echo in the present, they're still present, and yet they're also emanating from the past. And I think we need to be able to both hold those things together and to distinguish them at the same time. And that's a tricky thing, and probably does, as you're pushing me to do, require us to think more and to theorize more. I guess the other aspect, I'll just quickly, the other aspect of your question that I didn't address yet is sort of how do we become aware of our implication, and especially how do we become motivated to act against it? I guess I don't think I was trying to argue in the book, or at least I don't remember trying to argue in the book, that it's history that awakens us to our implication exactly. I think it's social movements or something like that. So to go back to the Black Lives Matter reference from the previous question, it's social movements, often by people who are themselves directly impacted by these injustices, that I think can awaken feelings of implication, though they can also, as in the previous question, awaken resentment and a kind of reaction and refusal to recognize implication, right? A refusal to feel guilty, a refusal to feel shame for what had happened. But I think it's more, I would say, if we're looking for how these things start to percolate up into consciousness, I think it has to do with social movements, and it may be on an individual level, happens because of particular encounters that we have. Certainly for me, if I think about the Israeli-Palestinian question, which has become important to me over the years, it had to do initially with personal encounters with Palestinians, which I did not have growing up, right? And so I received a very one-sided picture of that history and of that situation. And it was actually meeting people who had direct connections to it and direct histories of suffering linked to that political situation that really jarred me and forced me to start thinking differently about some of these kinds of questions. So I think it can happen in different ways. But I guess I don't think I'm arguing that it's history as such that is producing that sort of awareness.
Thank you, Michael. We have a question now from Nicolas Ramos Flores.
Okay.
Nicolas, if you want, you can share your screen there.
Yeah, hi, my name's Nicolas. You sort of addressed a lot of the stuff with this question, but I'll ask it. I guess one of the things that I've been sort of thinking through quite a bit is that idea of implication, and sort of part with this question that you just answered. It makes me think of a bit of that quote, and other theorists have this idea of like slavery didn't end, it just sort of evolved. Right. And I guess one of the questions that I've been trying to unravel and thinking through in theorizations, I use your work and appreciative of the contributions you've made. But one of the things that I guess I've been struggling with in my own theorizations is that idea of, this idea of the implicated subject for like Black or diasporic subjects in the Americas. Like, can we say that like slavery is just an echo when then there's these real material implications? Right. And thinking through, the era of mass incarceration and some other, or apartheid in South Africa, right? That it's like, it's no longer the past, but it's not an echo, it's sort of the real material reality of the today. But I concede the point, right, of it, you are sort of complicating that inherent idea of you either a victim or a perpetrator. And I was wondering if you could shed light a little bit on that reality. And obviously there's variations within Afro-diasporic subjects, as that it's not the chattel slavery of 19th and previous centuries, but at the same time, I think that there is a real suffering that occurs there, a real traumatic experience that occurs there, that then, again, this is something that I've been thinking about for years now, and sort of how to like concretize that a little bit more, to use some Spanglish there. But if you could just shed light more than anything else.
Thank you. That's a really great question. I think that's really, really important, and it's related, I see, to the previous question as well. I'm using my terminology, maybe got a little bit loose there in talking about echoes. I was referring partly to the work of art specifically, that you seem to have these visual echoes in that sense. But obviously in a place like South Africa, and I think make this point in the book, and I actually think that Kentridge is actually exploring this, the relations of post-apartheid, transitional and post-apartheid, are as brutal and in some ways more brutal than the relations of apartheid. Inequality is obviously persistent and has not in any way gone away. And I think that's actually what he's, one of the things that he is exploring. And obviously lots of other people are exploring that as well. In the US context, I would not be, I am very, I'm a huge fan of Saidiya Hartman's work, and Lose Your Mother is a really powerful book for me, and it's a complicated book, and in fact I think it would be interesting to think along some of these lines, because she is exploring, as someone like Carol Phillips is exploring as well in his novels, some of these complicated relationships across the Black diaspora and back to Africa, and the different positioning that Black subjects have in relationship to the history of slavery in Africa as well as right in the New World. And she's very kind of explicit about that. And both of them are at times drawing a great deal of attention to African complicity in the slave trade, right? And that's something that I, will mention, but it's not, I don't feel it's my job to emphasize that or to make that the center of the work that I'm doing, because but I think you can talk about people in that context as also implicated, right? I think, in terms of then, but what I was about to say about Hartman was, she talks there in the first chapter of Lose Your Mother about the afterlives of slavery specifically. And it's precisely in those material relations of incarceration and continuing differentiations in life expectancy and all of this health, all of this kind of stuff that, yes, I absolutely think that slavery lives on. And I think the question then becomes one, and it's partly a kind of theoretical question, which I'm interested in, but it probably also has real political consequences, of the relations between continuity and discontinuity. I mean, that's what we're talking about, right? To what extent can we talk about continuities with the past, and to what extent do we also want to acknowledge discontinuities? Right. And again, as in my previous answer, I guess I'm trying to thread this needle here, or have it both ways, or have it always, or something like that. I guess I really do believe both in continuity and discontinuity. And that's partly what my notion of the perpetuator is getting at too, right? That we're not simply repeating the past, but we're perpetuating, we're sending, it's taking new forms, it morphs and this sort of thing. And I think that's important. And I think I guess what I'm saying is I do think it's important to be able to recognize the specificity of the new relations that we live in, even if they grow out of, even fairly directly, the relationships of the past and the relations of the historical relations. I think it's important, both intellectually, but maybe even more so politically, to be able to say what's different about the present, as well as what links it to a history like slavery, I suppose. I was thinking about this. I was watching one of your previous sessions, Anna and Alex, with Dan Hicks and his book, The Brutish Museums, which I've been reading with great interest. And I guess, for me, he's making a very strong argument about continuity, right? And the continuities of late 19th century corporate colonial war, as he calls it, and the relations of the contemporary museum. And I guess I find myself, and I'm still reading the book, and I certainly think it's a really great and really provocative and important book, I find myself pushing back a little bit and wanting a little bit more sense of discontinuity. That what's happening in the contemporary museum isn't simply a direct repetition of those small wars, quote unquote, that he's talking about in the 19th century, but it's some sort of new configuration, some sort of new instantiation of those relations. That kind of maybe cuts against the provocation of the book. I don't think it has to necessarily. I guess all I'm trying to say really is that I think there's a similar question there of how do we measure the continuity, and how do we mark the discontinuities between a particular moment in the past and its afterlives, even its afterlives in the present. But what I'm especially interested in, is what this means again for implicated subjects, right? So not only for those who continue to be oppressed, dominated, victimized by the afterlives of those histories and structures in the present, people of color, Black people in particular, but also, again, what are the responsibilities for those of us who are not descendants of that history, are not marked as descendants of that history in our society, and precisely for that reason bear a responsibility for it? And I think, again, there it's important to think of discontinuities as well as continuities, I suppose. And just to say one more thing about Dan Hicks's book, one of the things that struck me as I tried to bring it, think about how it related to my own project, I was thinking about that figure of the curator, not just a figure. For him, he actually is a curator, I realized that. But for me, I wanted to say that the curator is not a perpetrator, as they sometimes seem to be in his work, but maybe a perpetuator, right? Again, a figure of the implicated subject who has inherited these objects from the past and now certainly bears a responsibility for them and a responsibility to repair this violence and this brokenness that emerges from the past, but in the figure, I guess I would say in my terms, of the implicated subject and not the perpetrator. which implies, again, that there's a certain discontinuity from the violence of the past, and therefore, yeah, not just a direct line that can be drawn. I mean, you can draw it in some ways, I realize, but I think it's also important to recognize some of the ways that we're discontinuous with the past as well. I hope that gets at your question, Nicholas, a bit.
Yeah, no, it's something that I've just been, trying to like toil with now for, like I said, a couple of years, particularly also like how do you do oppressions, intersectional oppressions then along with the past ones and de-linking them. But I like this kind of concept that you're, the distinction between the continuity versus the discontinuity and sitting them side by side is sort of useful.
Yeah, and I guess the one thing I'd say is I think there's also an asymmetry between those who inherit and experience victimization and those who are, again, in my terms, implicated subjects, right? That we shouldn't, the fact that a certain kind of racial violence is constant and continuous in American history, which it absolutely is, and keeps producing new victims, we can't necessarily find exactly the same continuity on the side of those who benefit from it, right? Again, I think for those of us who've kind of migrated into, whose families migrated into this history, it's not a purely symmetrical relation. I can't trace my genealogy back to 19th century America. Doesn't make me less responsible, but it creates a kind of asymmetry perhaps in that relationship. I don't know, that's still thinking about this too, but I think it's important not to assume that these positions of victim and perpetrator are symmetrical. In fact, I think it's important to theorize them as asymmetrical, and therefore what follows from them is also potentially going to be asymmetrical.
Right. Oh, yeah.
If I can take my prerogative as co-host to ask a quick question. As you're well aware, some of the critiques of human rights are that, of course, they end up being too much about the subject and not enough about, the system. So with all of your theoretical work on the implicated subject, I kept thinking about the implicated system that is too strong for us, for any subject. Or for collectivities it's even difficult for collectivities to form short of revolutions to overturn. I always think in terms of when it comes to reparations, like, with what army are you going to get those reparations, right? Because moral suasion is not going to work in most of these cases, right? So when it comes to some of these systems, like despite the perpetuator, even if we get, despite all these other roles that could be changed at the individual level, maybe, or at the group level, or the guild level, if you want to call them, I still think that some implicated systems will not be moved by our assemblages. I don't know. Can you say a little bit more about your own thinking about how you differentiate between an implicated subject and an implicated system as a? I'm going to just use your own terminology too.
Yeah, interesting. No, it's also a really good question, a really important question. I mean, I guess I'm enough of a Marxist to agree entirely with you to say that, that we're talking about systems that, really need to be transformed from the ground up in a radical way, in a kind of revolutionary way, if we're going to really transform them, at least for some of these things. So yeah, I mean, I agree. I guess I do agree with that. I guess, what I always say, and I think it's true, at least in terms of how I think of the book, this notion for me of implication is important because of the way that it links up subjects and systems, right? So I guess what I'm trying to do is to theorize in between those two poles, if you will. And I guess I'm inspired here partly, again, it wasn't even so much consciously necessarily as I was working on this, but I think in terms of my training, in terms of the kind of theoretical background I come to this with, by someone like Althusser and his notion of ideological state apparatuses, right, which are producing subjects. And so subjects are, and good subjects, tame subjects, there's also a Foucauldian, dimension to this. Tame subjects are essential to the functioning of the system. And by analogy, what I'm trying to say is implicated subjects are essential to the functioning of some of these systems. It's a kind of analytical point, And here again, I refer to that Simona Forti book that I mentioned earlier, and this notion of the transmission belt. So, right, that notion of the subject as transmission belt of domination is trying to, again, establish how we get from one level to the other. So analytically, I think that's important to think about the role that subjects play in the upholding of these systems. But that doesn't yet answer your question, which is about transformation. And, you know, and I agree. I think that transformation is going to have to, you know, it has to happen. It has to happen from below. It has to happen in collective struggles, I suppose, but probably also can only happen at certain moments where the systems enter into a kind of crisis or a period of vulnerability or what have you. I'm not enough of a historian or a sociologist or political scientist to tell you exactly when that's going to be. It's not really what I study. I'm really coming, because I do come at it from the literary cultural side. You know, I probably have a built-in bias toward, you know, individual production, aesthetic production, and this sort of thing. You know, but then to walk that back a little bit, yeah, and so, I mean, yes, if some of the larger systems and structures that are important here are very difficult to change, except in the terms that you mentioned, a sort of revolutionary transformation. I guess I still believe that social movements at a smaller scale can make an impact in and can produce significant changes on the ground for a lot of these kinds of questions. And I guess here I would think of something like, since we've been talking about it, since it's on all of our minds, and because it actually does play a role in the book to a certain extent, something like Black Lives Matter, a social movement like Black Lives Matter. You know, obviously it hasn't eliminated the problems that it seeks to address by any stretch of the imagination, and yet you couldn't say it hasn't had an impact. And I guess I'm interested, I wrote the book obviously before what happened in 2020, but I was thinking a lot in 2020 about what it meant that those George Floyd demonstrations became the largest demonstrations in American history and also spread internationally to the extent that they did. And, you know, there's a lot of different ways to think about that. I certainly don't have an answer to it, and I'm not proposing one answer to it. I think the pandemic played a role, and that on the one hand, there were a lot of people feeling precisely vulnerable at that moment, and that somehow allowed a kind of leap of solidarity. But I guess I also feel like one of the differences in 2020 versus the earlier Black Lives Matter moment is that the protests were a lot more diverse, right? And that a lot of white people did come out this time, at least, you know, back then. I don't know what's happened since then. 70 million of them still voted for Trump, but you know, something happened last June. And I do feel like it was because a certain percentage of the population started to see not just this is an injustice, but I am also somehow implicated in what's going on, right? That this isn't just about a few rogue cops or a few individual perpetrators, but this really is systemic and structural. And that proved one of the motivating forces that brought so many millions of people out into the streets. And again, the system didn't topple, really. And yet, you know, it was an advance, and it changed the conversation and had ripple effects around the globe that started to, you know, leak into various other histories far from the US and far from police violence in the US, and started to impact precisely on the legacies of slavery and colonialism and the toppling of monuments and all that sort of stuff. So, you know, I'm not, I guess I have a slightly optimistic sensibility, at the same time, not in a Pollyanna-ish way. I'm not expecting the theorization of the implicated subject to lead immediately to revolutionary change. But I guess I feel like it's an important, or can be an important analytical tool in understanding how systems work and how histories reproduce themselves over time. And I think it can be important for thinking about alliances and coalitions between people who are differently situated in relationship to these structures and histories. And that coalitions and alliances, back to the CRC, are going to be across lines that bring together victims and implicated subjects. And it's good for us at least to understand that and to think about that, and especially for those of us who are implicated, to be aware of that and self-reflexive about that when we seek to join in some of these kinds of movements. That's all I got.
Thank you, Michael. We have about 15 minutes, and then just I would like to have a sort of open question to allow you to perhaps to make more connections with some of the issues that that we discussed up to here. And one of the elements that are perhaps for some people who are here, they are not necessarily familiar with the fact that we do not have much studies up to this day that connect the memory of atrocities like the Holocaust and slavery and colonialism. And this is the kind of work that you did already with the multidirectional memory. And here I think that you expand much more in a crucial moment when we have all these layers that you referred to in your presentation. They become even more clear than the fact that certain individuals are in a position of being victimized today, but also benefited at some point from the victimization of other groups and also the dispossession of other groups. I am thinking here about the example, the Japanese and indigenous peoples that you mentioned in your presentation. And of course, when you are discussing the issue of slavery, and this is why then listening to you, this comes back to mind again, because we have these realities, especially the debates also that we see among historians, but also on social media regarding the implicated subjects who are Africans or of African descent, which is a topic that, depending on where you are, can be a taboo, the same way that if we discussed these intermediaries in many ways in Holocaust studies, it can be something that is problematic and not everybody can talk about it. But I think that your work allows them to create these connections and to see these different layers. And of course, on the one hand, we need to have the discussions reaching wider audiences. And to some extent, this is what we do with the book club. We take books that are academic, and everybody is welcome to attend and to read and to participate in the discussion, not as if you were at the university in a room where only people who are connected to the academic world could attend. It still is a problem because these are not issues that can be simplified. They are complex and they remain complex. I am thinking here, for example, about the genealogical connections that you referred to, then people who are not descendants. And this idea of descendant has emerged a lot recently when we had these more recent debates on the issue of reparations. Then individuals who are not descendants of those who own enslaved people, but who benefited from white supremacy. But then we have descendants of people who were enslaved, who will need to prove that they were descendants. And there are even proposals recently by scholars that I will not name that think that we should have a sort of genealogical commission to establish who you are in order to get reparations for slavery. You understand that perhaps you have this for the Holocaust, but this was when the Holocaust was happened 10, 20 years ago, not 200 years ago. Right. And I think about, what about then those individuals who are not descendants necessarily of enslaved people, but just because of the fact that they are Black in a country like the United States or in France or in England or in Portugal, they are victims of racism and white supremacy because of this long-standing connection between being Black and being a slave. Then I think that this is why your work is so important, and I would love that this conversation continues, because I think that is just starting. Then with the book that you bring here, for example, I have discussions in my book that of course has been inspired from your work for a while, but I do not engage with this one because it was already when the book was done.
Yeah.
And then we have all these debates, for example, on the Confederate monuments, not only of those asking to take down the monuments, but then you have individuals who are suddenly defending these monuments by arguing that they are the descendants of those who fought for the Confederacy.
Mm-hmm.
And we have, of course, the memorialization of the Holocaust, which is also changing because many of the survivors who were around us 10 years ago are no longer there now. And then we have all the discussion on colonialism and the debate that you brought regarding the book by Dan Hicks that also poses similar problems when you are talking about, for example, certain objects that perhaps were stolen, but those who who are the owners of the objects, they were also taking then the heritage and the material culture from other people or enslaving them and so on. Then I hope that this is a conversation that is just starting, and I would like you then, if you have any if you want to engage with this or not, or if you have any elements that you were not able to address and yet you would like to discuss, or perhaps also mention what you plan to do after this book, if there is something that comes from it.
Yeah, thank you, Anna. Thank you again for the invitation, and thank you, Alex, also for hosting. I mean, I think that was really a beautiful statement, actually, in which you really managed to link together so much that's happening now, right? And so much certainly that's important to me, and I think, and to you as well, as I realize. And I think it's, you know, it does feel like we're in a very particular moment when there's a coming together of multiple pasts and of also very intense, for lack of a better word, relations in the present, which are also connected very intimately to those pasts, and that we really are in a moment, a kind of intense moment when things are both changing and kind of exploding to the surface, if you will. I've been in the last year, especially kind of involved in discussions in Germany that are actually very public discussions. To go back to Kofo's point earlier, she's maybe not, okay, I think she is still here, in fact. I mean, that's a place where I have tried to intervene a little bit more publicly, actually, precisely around some of the kinds of questions we've been discussing, where because in Germany you have a very, very powerful discourse of the Holocaust uniqueness, like Kofo was also referring to in the UK context as well, where there's really this very strong stricture against comparing the Holocaust. And it's in some ways for a good reason, right? It's in the name of claiming responsibility, precisely for recognizing yourself as an implicated subject. But it's become a kind of discourse that wards off other kinds of implication and other sorts of responsibilities. So Black German activists, decolonial activists, and others in Germany have now for some years been pushing for greater recognition of the crimes of German colonialism and the ongoing forms of responsibility and implication that go along with that history. And there's a lot of resistance to that within Germany. And the excuse that's given, and I'll call it an excuse, is that, well, if we start to think about German colonialism in relation to the Holocaust, we're relativizing the Holocaust and we're relativizing German responsibility for the Holocaust. And my argument, and some of you who've been following this will know that this played out, for example, in relationship to the Cameroonian historian and philosopher Achille Mbembe, who was accused of anti-Semitism, both for his criticism of Israel, but also for allegedly, and I think it's not quite what he's doing, in fact, comparing the Holocaust to apartheid. And so these are very political and very public conversations that are going on in Germany. And the argument that I've tried to make, both drawing on multidirectional memory, but also on the implicated subject, is one, right, again, memory doesn't function like a zero-sum game. We can remember the Holocaust and we can also remember German colonialism at the same time. It's not one or the other. And even more importantly for that discussion, responsibility is not a zero-sum game either. And in fact, there is no, Black German or decolonial activist who is arguing that responsibility for German colonialism needs to replace responsibility for the Holocaust. It's a model of supplementation, right? It's a model of multiplicity and multiplication. And in fact, what I'm trying to get people to recognize is that we are all, many of us are, implicated in multiple histories simultaneously. And just as remembering slavery in the United States will not detract from remembering the Holocaust and vice versa, asserting German responsibility for crimes in today's Namibia, Southwest Africa, the genocide that took place there, or the massacres that happened in other German colonies, is not going to get rid of German responsibility or memory of the Holocaust, right? It can be, we need more complicated, as you say, models that can allow us to think about these things simultaneously, right? And to see how they, again, I'll use the word echo each other sometimes, are tangled with each other sometimes, but in no way need to be conceived as pushing each other out of attention. In a kind of zero-sum struggle for recognition. I just don't think that's how historical responsibility works. And I think, so I guess to go back to Kofo, I think if I can make this argument in the German context, I can also try to make it in the American context too, and or the English-speaking world as well. And I do think that's, this is the challenge today, is to think these histories together, not by reducing them to each other. And this goes back to Nicholas's question about continuity and discontinuity, but to be able to perceive both similarities and differences, right? To recognize the distinct kind of claims that different histories make on us, but also the fact that they are often entangled with each other. And it's not an either or thing, that we can think both at the same time. And I guess I think that's the challenge for me, at least intellectually, and I guess politically as well.
Thank you so much, Michael. It was really great to have you, and I really hope also that with the discussion here today, and this is going to be available on YouTube, that people get the book, and that we have more discussions also connecting the book to no, this one is not
a zero-sum game. You can get
either of that. But I think that then the book, for those of you, then the implicated subject, Beyond Victims and Perpetrators, this is a book by Stanford University Press, 2019. And I really hope that the book gets much more attention, and in conversations that involve the debates here in the United States as well, regarding slavery and regarding then the legacy of Jim Crow and white supremacy. And thank you so much, Michael, for coming. And for those of you who attended, thank you so much. And reminding you that we have another book that perhaps will again make more connections with what we had here, and also with the book by Dan Hicks. This is A Fistful of Shells by Toby Green, who is professor of history at King's College. Then a Fistful of Shells, West Africa, from the rise of the slave trade to the age of revolution, and works a lot also with the current legacies of the Atlantic slave trade on the dispossession of the African continent. It's a beautiful book, huge book, and I hope you can attend. This is going to be on Saturday, this Saturday, February 20, at 1 p.m., and it's going to be on YouTube as well. And I also thank you, Kofu, because she was also putting some comments here, then emphasizing also that the book, the implicated subject should be reaching much larger audiences. Also, I thank Alex, that I don't know if he's showing up on video. And also our co-hosts who are not here, but they were behind the scenes during all the organization of this, were Jessica Johnson from Hopkins, and also Vanessa Holden from the University of Kentucky. Again, Michael, thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and much success to the book, and stay healthy and safe. Thank you all. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.